It was a warm Sunday evening in 1952 when Margaret first heard Robert's voice. She was 22 years old, sitting at the old upright piano in the church basement, her fingers dancing across the yellowed keys as she practiced hymns for the next morning's service. The weekly church social was happening upstairs, but Margaret preferred the quiet of the basement where she could play without anyone listening, or so she thought. When she finished playing Amazing Grace, she heard slow clapping behind her. Margaret turned around startled to see a tall young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile standing near the basement stairs. He was about her age, wearing a simple white shirt and dark trousers, his hair neatly combed to one side. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice warm and a little nervous. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was looking for the bathroom and heard the most beautiful piano playing. I just had to stop and listen." Margaret felt her cheeks turn red. She wasn't used to compliments about her playing. "Oh, it's nothing special. I'm just practicing for tomorrow." "Nothing special." Robert walked closer to the piano. "Miss, that was the most beautiful version of Amazing Grace I've ever heard. You play like an angel." That's how it all began. Robert introduced himself as the new tenor in the church choir. He had just moved to town for work at the local bank and was looking for a church home. Margaret was the church pianist, a position she had held since she was 16, when old Mrs. Thompson's arthritis got too bad for her to play. They spent the next hour talking about music. Robert told her about growing up in a family where his mother played violin and his father sang in barbershop quartets. Margaret shared how her grandmother had saved up for 2 years to buy the family's first piano when Margaret was 8 years old. "Would you mind if I sang while you played?" Robert asked as the evening grew late. "I promise I won't embarrass you." Margaret nodded and placed her hands back on the keys. She started with "How Great Thou Art," and when Robert began to sing, she nearly stopped playing. His voice was pure and strong, filling the basement with a sound so beautiful it made her heart skip. They fit together perfectly, her piano and his voice, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting their whole lives to be joined. From that night forward, they were inseparable. Every Sunday after church, they would practice together in the basement. Margaret would play while Robert sang, and slowly other church members began finding excuses to come downstairs just to listen to them. Pastor William started asking them to perform special music during services. Their first official date was to a piano recital in the next town over. Robert borrowed his boss's car and drove Margaret to the concert hall, both of them dressed in their Sunday best. Margaret had never seen a professional pianist perform before, and she watched in wonder as the musician's hands flew across the keys. During intermission, Robert bought her a small box of chocolates and told her that someday people would pay to hear her play just like they were doing tonight. "Don't be silly," Margaret laughed. "I'm just a small-town church pianist." "You're so much more than that," Robert said seriously. "You have a gift, Margaret. When you play, it's like you're speaking directly to people's hearts." As months passed, their relationship deepened. Robert would walk Margaret home after choir practice, and they would sit on her front porch swing, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his dreams of maybe opening his own business someday. She shared her secret wish of traveling to New York City to hear the Philharmonic Orchestra. Margaret's parents adored Robert. Her father, a quiet man who worked at the grain elevator, appreciated Robert's politeness and strong work ethic. Her mother loved how Robert always complimented her cooking, and how he made Margaret laugh in a way she never had before. The proposal came on a snowy December evening in 1953. Margaret was playing Christmas carols at the church's holiday service, when Robert surprised everyone by standing up from the choir loft and walking down to the piano. The congregation watched in curious silence as he knelt beside the piano bench. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "for the past year and a half you've filled my life with the most beautiful music, not just with your piano, but with your laughter, your kindness, and your love. Would you do me the honor of making music with me for the rest of our lives?" He pulled out a simple gold ring with a small diamond, nothing fancy, but bought with months of savings from his bank salary. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she nodded yes. The entire congregation erupted in applause and cheers. They were married on a bright spring morning in May 1954, right there in the same church where they had met. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Robert wore a new black suit that he would later joke was the most expensive thing he had ever bought. During the ceremony, instead of having recorded music, Margaret's cousin played the piano while Robert sang "The Way You Look Tonight" directly to his bride. Their honeymoon was simple, a weekend at a small lake cabin 2 hours away. But even there, Robert found an old piano in the main lodge and convinced Margaret to play while guests gathered around to listen. "Wherever we go," he told her, "we bring music with us." They moved into a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street with a white picket fence and a big front yard. Robert's first priority was finding a piano for their home. He searched for weeks until he found a beautiful upright piano at an estate sale. It took 6 men and a borrowed truck to move it into their living room. But when Margaret sat down and played their wedding song for the first time in their own home, Robert knew every penny and every sore muscle had been worth it. Sunday mornings became their special tradition. Margaret would wake up early and make coffee while Robert read the newspaper. Then, as breakfast cooked on the stove, she would sit at the piano and play "The Way You Look Tonight." Robert would join her on the piano bench, sometimes singing along, sometimes just holding her hand while she played. Their children came in the following years, first David in 1955, then Linda in 1957, and finally little Michael in 1960. The house filled with the sounds of children's laughter, but music remained at the center of everything. Margaret would play lullabies to help the babies sleep and teach them simple songs. As they grew older, Robert would come home from work at the bank and gather the whole family around the piano for evening sing-alongs. "Music makes everything better," Margaret would tell her children when they were sad or scared. "It connects our hearts when words aren't enough." Even as Robert climbed the ladder at the bank, eventually becoming a loan officer, and Margaret took on more responsibilities at church, including directing the children's choir, they never let their busy lives interfere with their Sunday morning tradition. For over 40 years, every single Sunday morning began the same way, with Margaret playing their wedding song while Robert sat beside her, grateful for the music that had brought them together and kept them strong through all of life's ups and downs. It was a Tuesday morning in early September 1994, and Margaret was humming while she prepared breakfast in their kitchen. At 67, she still woke up early every day, just like she had for the past 40 years of marriage. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the house as golden sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows. Robert was already outside in his garden, something that had become his retirement passion. After working at the bank for 35 years, he had finally retired the year before, and gardening had become his new love. Margaret could see him through the window, kneeling beside his prized tomato plants, carefully picking the ripe ones for breakfast. "Those tomatoes are going to be perfect with scrambled eggs," she called out to him through the open kitchen door. "Coming right up," Robert called back, his voice cheerful as always. "Just give me 5 more minutes with these beauties." Margaret smiled and continued setting the table. Their 3 children were all grown now, with families of their own. David lived 2 hours away and worked as a teacher. Linda had moved to California after college and was raising twin daughters. Michael, their youngest, lived closest to them, just 20 minutes away, and stopped by every weekend with his wife and young son. The house felt too quiet sometimes without the sounds of children, but Margaret and Robert had settled into a comfortable rhythm. They spent their mornings in the garden together, afternoons reading or listening to music, and evenings watching television or playing cards with neighbors. Margaret was buttering toast when she heard a strange sound from outside. It wasn't quite a shout, but more like a confused grunt. She looked toward the window but couldn't see Robert anymore. "Robert," she called out. "Everything okay out there?" Silence. A cold feeling crept up Margaret's spine. In 40 years of marriage, Robert always answered when she called. Always. She quickly turned off the stove and hurried outside, still wearing her apron. The morning air was crisp and pleasant, but Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Robert?" She called again, louder this time. She found him collapsed between the tomato plants and the garden fence. He was lying on his side, his body perfectly still except for shallow, irregular breathing. His eyes were closed, and his face had a strange, pale color that Margaret had never seen before. "Oh my God, Robert!" She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she touched his face. His skin felt cold and clammy. "Robert, can you hear me? Please, honey, open your eyes." Margaret had never felt panic like this before. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might explode. With trembling hands, she checked his pulse the way she had learned in a first aid class years ago. It was there, but weak and uneven. She ran back to the house as fast as her legs could carry her and dialed 911. Her voice was shaking so badly she could barely speak. "My husband collapsed in our garden," she managed to tell the operator. "He's breathing, but he won't wake up. Please send someone quickly." The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours. Margaret sat beside Robert in the garden, holding his hand and talking to him constantly, begging him to open his eyes. She told him about breakfast waiting on the stove, about their grandson's upcoming birthday party, about anything she could think of that might bring him back to her. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics worked quickly and efficiently. They asked Margaret questions she could barely answer through her tears. How old was he? Did he have any medical conditions? Was he taking any medications? Had he complained of feeling sick recently? "He was fine this morning," Margaret kept repeating. "He was perfectly fine. He was picking tomatoes and laughing and talking to me through the window." The paramedics loaded Robert onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. Margaret rode with them to the hospital, holding Robert's hand and whispering prayers under her breath. The siren seemed impossibly loud, and the whole world felt like it was moving too fast. At the hospital, everything became a blur of bright lights, rushing medical staff, and confusing medical terms. A young doctor with kind eyes explained to Margaret that Robert had suffered a massive stroke. The technical words flew over her head, but she understood the important parts. Robert's brain had been severely damaged, and he was in a deep coma. "We've stabilized him for now," the doctor said gently. "But I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Johnson. This was a very serious stroke. The next 48 hours are critical." Margaret called their children from the hospital phone. Each conversation was the hardest thing she had ever done. David dropped everything and drove straight to the hospital. Linda booked the first flight she could find from California. Michael arrived within an hour, still wearing his work clothes. For 3 days, the family took turns sitting beside Robert's hospital bed. He looked so small and fragile connected to all those machines. The steady beeping of the heart monitor became the soundtrack of their new reality. Robert's doctor, Dr. Peterson, was a man in his 50s who had seen many stroke patients over the years. He spoke to the family with gentle honesty that Margaret both appreciated and dreaded. "The brain scans show extensive damage," he explained during a family meeting on the 4th day. "At this point, we're looking at the possibility of long-term care. Many patients who suffer strokes this severe never regain consciousness." "But some do, right?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some people do wake up?" Dr. Peterson hesitated before answering. "Yes, some do. But I want you to understand that the longer someone remains in a coma, especially at Robert's age, the less likely recovery becomes." After the first few weeks, the chances decreased significantly. Margaret's children began having quiet conversations in the hospital hallway. She could see them whispering, looking at her with worried expressions. They were trying to prepare themselves for the worst, but Margaret refused to join those conversations. 2 weeks after the stroke, Robert was transferred to a long-term care facility. Margaret hated the smell of the place. Too much disinfectant, trying to cover up too many sad stories. But the staff was kind, and Robert's room had a window that looked out onto a small garden. On their first night in the new facility, Margaret pulled a chair up beside Robert's bed and took his hand. His fingers were thin and cool, so different from the strong, warm hands that had held hers for 40 years. "I know you can hear me," she whispered. "The doctors don't think so, but I know better. We've been together too long for you to just disappear on me now." She started talking to him about everything and nothing, just like they used to do on their front porch swing. She told him about the neighbors who had brought casseroles, about their grandson's first day of school, about how their tomatoes were finally turning red in the garden. 3 weeks became 6 weeks. 6 weeks became 3 months. Robert's condition remained unchanged, stable but unresponsive. His eyes never opened, he never moved on his own, and he never showed any sign of awareness. Margaret's children gradually began suggesting that maybe it was time to think about other arrangements. Maybe she should consider moving Robert to a different facility. Maybe she should think about what Robert would want. Maybe she should start thinking about her own future. But Margaret had made her decision. She moved a small cot into Robert's room and began what she knew in her heart would be a long journey. Every morning she would wake up beside him and start talking, telling him about her dreams, about the weather, about anything that came to mind. "The doctors think I'm crazy," she told him one quiet evening as rain drummed against the window. "Maybe I am. But 40 years of marriage taught me something they don't understand. Love doesn't just disappear because someone can't open their eyes or say your name. Love is stronger than that, and I'm going to prove it to everyone, especially to you." Margaret's alarm clock went off at exactly 6:30 every morning, just like it had for the past 30 years. She would get up from her small cot in Robert's room, wash her face in the tiny bathroom sink, and start her day the same way she always did, by talking to her husband. "Good morning, sweetheart," she would say, pulling back the curtains to let sunlight into the room. "It's going to be a beautiful day today. I can already hear the birds singing outside your window." The nursing staff at Sunset Manor had long ago stopped being surprised by Margaret's routine. When she first moved into Robert's room in 1994, some of them thought she would stay for a few weeks, maybe a month at most. But as weeks turned into months and months turned into years, they realized that Margaret wasn't going anywhere. "She's the most devoted wife I've ever seen," whispered Nancy, one of the day shift nurses, to her colleague during Margaret's 5th year of living at the facility. "I've never seen anything like it." Margaret's daily schedule never changed. She would wake up at 6:30, spend an hour getting Robert ready for the day, washing his face gently with a warm cloth, combing his hair the way he always liked it, and making sure his favorite blue pajamas were clean and comfortable. Then she would sit beside his bed and read him the morning newspaper, commenting on every story as if he might respond at any moment. "Listen to this, honey," she would say, rustling the pages. "They're building a new shopping center where old Murphy's farm used to be. Remember how we used to buy corn from him every summer? You always said he grew the sweetest corn in 3 counties. The first few years were the hardest. Margaret's children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren who were growing up without really knowing their grandfather. David would sit quietly beside the bed, sometimes reading work papers while Margaret hummed softly. Linda called every week from California, always asking if there had been any changes, always hoping for good news that never came. Michael, being the closest, visited most often. He would bring his young son Tommy, who was fascinated by all the medical equipment. Margaret loved these visits because she could tell Robert all about his grandson's achievements, his first steps, his first words, his first day of school. "Tommy drew you a picture today," Margaret would tell Robert, holding up a crayon drawing of stick figures. "He says this one is you and this one is me, and we're standing in your garden. He wants to plant tomatoes with you when you wake up." As the years passed, some family members and friends began suggesting that Margaret was living in denial. Her sister visited from out of state and was shocked to see Margaret still maintaining her vigil after 7 years. "Margaret, honey," her sister said gently during a private conversation in the facility's small cafe, "don't you think Robert would want you to live your own life? You're missing out on so much." But Margaret's response was always the same. "This is my life. Robert is my life. I made a promise 40 years ago to love him in sickness and in health, and I meant every word of it." The facility staff grew to love Margaret like family. She remembered everyone's birthdays, asked about their children, and always had a kind word when someone was having a difficult day. During the holidays, she would decorate Robert's room with lights and garlands, playing Christmas music softly on a small radio she kept beside his bed. "She brings joy to this place," said Helen, the head nurse who had worked at the facility for 15 years. Even in the middle of her own heartbreak, she finds ways to make other people smile. Margaret celebrated every anniversary as if Robert were awake. On their 45th wedding anniversary, she brought a small cake to his room and played their wedding song on a portable tape player. She cut 2 pieces of cake, eating one herself and leaving the other on his bedside table. 45 years, sweetheart," she said, holding his hand. "And I love you just as much today as I did when you sang to me in that church basement." The most difficult times came when other patients in the facility passed away. Margaret would attend their funeral services, comforting grieving families while struggling with her own fears about what the future might hold. But she never let these moments shake her faith that Robert would eventually come back to her. Music became Margaret's constant companion during these long years. She couldn't bring a piano to the facility, but she filled Robert's room with the songs they had shared throughout their marriage. She would hum while changing his sheets, sing softly while helping the nurses with his physical therapy, and play their favorite records during the quiet afternoon hours. "Music is the language of the heart," she would tell visitors. "Even if Robert can't respond, I know his heart still hears every note." Margaret aged gracefully but noticeably during those 30 years. Her brown hair turned silver, then white. Lines deepened around her eyes and mouth. Her hands, once smooth and strong from years of piano playing, became spotted and slightly shaky with arthritis. But her spirit never dimmed. The facility's chaplain, Father Miguel, became one of Margaret's closest friends. He would visit Robert's room regularly, not just to pray but to listen to Margaret's stories about their life together. She had thousands of them, funny moments, romantic gestures, family adventures, and quiet everyday miracles that made up a marriage. "How do you keep your faith so strong?" Father Miguel asked her one day, as she sat knitting beside Robert's bed. Margaret looked up from her needles and smiled. "Faith isn't something you keep, Father. Faith is something you live. Every morning when I wake up next to Robert, every time I hold his hand, every moment I spend talking to him. That's faith in action." As Margaret entered her 80s, then her 90s, her own health began to require attention. She developed high blood pressure and had to take medication. Her knees ached from sleeping on the small cot for so many years, but she refused every suggestion that she might be more comfortable in her own apartment. "Robert needs me here," she would say firmly. "When he wakes up, I want to be the first face he sees." The nursing staff had long ago stopped trying to convince Margaret that Robert might never wake up. They had witnessed her devotion for decades and understood that her love transcended medical predictions. Some of the newer staff members would ask the veterans about the woman who lived in room 247 with her husband. "That's Mrs. Margaret," they would explain. "She's been here longer than any of us. She's the heart of this place." By 2020, Margaret had been by Robert's side for 26 years. She was 93 years old, still sharp mentally but physically frailer than she wanted to admit. The facility had become her world, and the staff and other families had become her extended family. During the pandemic, when visiting restrictions were put in place, Margaret was allowed to stay because she was considered a resident rather than a visitor. She spent those isolated months talking to Robert even more than usual, telling him about the strange new world outside where people wore masks and couldn't hug their loved ones. "We're lucky, you know," she told him during one of those lonely pandemic days. "We've never had to be apart, not for one single day in all these years." As Margaret approached her 97th birthday, she began having conversations with Robert about growing old together, something they had always planned to do but never expected to happen quite like this. "I know this isn't how we pictured our golden years," she said, adjusting his blankets with hands that shook slightly more each day. "But we're still together, and that's what matters most. We're still making music together, even if it's quieter now." Margaret woke up on her 100th birthday feeling different somehow. Not physically different. Her arthritis still ached, and her movements were still slow and careful. But there was something in the air, a sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite explain. "Good morning, my love," she whispered to Robert as she had every morning for the past 30 years. Today's a special day. It's my 100th birthday. Can you believe it? A whole century of life, and 30 of those years have been right here with you. The morning sunlight streamed through their window, casting a warm glow across Robert's peaceful face. At 97, he looked remarkably well for someone who had been in a coma for 3 decades. The nursing staff at Sunset Manor had taken excellent care of him, and Margaret's daily attention to his needs had kept him comfortable and dignified. Margaret had been planning to spend her centennial birthday the same way she spent every other day, quietly beside Robert, reading to him, talking about old memories and humming their favorite songs. She had specifically asked her family not to make a big fuss. At 100 years old, she insisted, all she wanted was peace and Robert's company. But her granddaughter Jenny had other plans. Jenny arrived at the facility around 10 in the morning, carrying what looked like birthday decorations and wearing a mischievous smile that reminded Margaret of Robert when he was planning a surprise. Jenny was David's daughter, now 35 years old with children of her own, but she had always been especially close to Margaret. "Happy birthday, Grandma," Jenny said, setting down her bags and giving Margaret a gentle but enthusiastic hug. "Are you ready for your surprise?" "Oh, honey, I told you I didn't want any fuss," Margaret protested, though she couldn't help smiling at her granddaughter's excitement. "At my age, just waking up is celebration enough." "Well, too bad," Jenny laughed. "Because I've been planning this for months, and I'm not taking no for an answer." Jenny began decorating Robert's room with streamers and balloons, chatting constantly as she worked. She told Margaret about her kids, about David's retirement party, about Linda's upcoming visit from California. Margaret watched with amusement as the usually quiet hospital room transformed into a festive celebration space. "There's one more thing," Jenny said, pulling out her phone. "I've been talking to the staff here, and they've agreed to help with something very special." Before Margaret could ask what she meant, there was a commotion in the hallway. Margaret heard the sound of wheels rolling and several people talking in hushed, excited voices. Jenny's smile got even bigger. "What on earth?" Margaret said, trying to peek out the door. "Just wait," Jenny said, barely able to contain her excitement. Moments later, 4 members of the facility's maintenance staff appeared in the doorway, carefully maneuvering a small upright piano into the room. It was old and slightly scarred, but it had been polished until it gleamed. Margaret's hands flew to her mouth in shock. "Jenny, what have you done?" she gasped. "I found it in the facility's storage room," Jenny explained as the men positioned the piano near Robert's bed. "The activities director said it used to be in the recreation room years ago, but they stopped using it when the regular pianist retired. I asked if we could bring it here for your birthday." Margaret stared at the piano in disbelief. She hadn't touched piano keys in 30 years, not since the morning Robert had his stroke. Her hands were so much older now, marked with age spots and twisted slightly with arthritis. Could she even still play? "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "My hands. I haven't played in so long." "Grandma," Jenny said softly, taking Margaret's hands in her own. "Do you remember what you used to tell me when I was little and afraid to try new things? You said that love gives us strength to do things we didn't think we could do." Margaret looked at the piano, then at Robert lying peacefully in his bed, then back at Jenny's hopeful face. Something stirred in her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in decades. It was the same feeling she used to get when she sat down at their home piano all those years ago. "What song should I play?" she asked quietly. Jenny's eyes filled with tears. "You know what song, Grandma?" Margaret approached the piano slowly, her heart beating faster than it had in years. She lifted the lid and looked down at the keys, black and white, just like every piano she had ever played. But somehow these seemed to hold all the promise in the world. She sat down on the small bench that Jenny had positioned just right and placed her hands over the keys without touching them yet. "The way you look tonight," she said softly. "Our wedding song." The first notes were tentative and shaky. Margaret's fingers felt stiff and uncertain after 3 decades away from music. But as she continued, something magical began to happen. The melody, etched so deeply in her heart and memory, began to flow through her hands despite their age and infirmity. "Tonight you're completely lovely," she sang in a voice that was weathered but still carried the tune beautifully. The song that had been theirs for over 70 years filled the small hospital room with a warmth and joy that seemed to chase away every shadow. Jenny stood near the door, tears streaming down her face as she watched her grandmother transform. This wasn't the frail centenarian who had spent 30 years in a hospital room. This was the young woman who had fallen in love with music, and with the man who sang to her in a church basement so many decades ago. Margaret was halfway through the second verse when she noticed something that made her voice catch in her throat. Robert's eyelids, which had been closed for 30 years, were fluttering. Just slightly, barely perceptible, but definitely moving. She kept playing, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid it might stop. The melody continued to pour from her fingers, and with each note, Robert's eyes seemed to flutter more. "Jenny," Margaret whispered without stopping her playing. "Look at his eyes." Jenny rushed to Robert's bedside just as his eyelids began to open slowly, like someone waking up from the deepest sleep imaginable. First just a crack, then wider, until his familiar brown eyes, the same eyes that had looked at Margaret with love for 40 years before the stroke, were fully open and looking directly at her. Margaret's hands trembled so violently she nearly stopped playing, but somehow she managed to finish the song. As the last notes faded away, the room fell into absolute silence except for the soft beeping of Robert's monitors and the sound of Margaret's labored breathing. Robert's lips moved slightly, and Margaret leaned closer to hear what he was trying to say. His voice, unused for 30 years, came out as barely a whisper. "Beautiful music." Margaret burst into tears, her whole body shaking with emotion she had kept buried for 3 decades. "Robert? Robert, can you hear me? It's Margaret. It's your wife." Robert's eyes focused on her face with obvious effort, and the corners of his mouth turned up in the faintest suggestion of the smile she had fallen in love with so many years ago. "Margaret," he whispered, and her name had never sounded more beautiful than it did coming from his lips after 30 years of silence. The news of Robert's awakening spread through Sunset Manor like wildfire. Within minutes of his first whispered words, nurses were rushing into the room, doctors were being called, and Margaret found herself in the center of what felt like a beautiful chaos. Dr. Henderson, the facility's head physician, arrived within 20 minutes. He was a young man, much younger than Dr. Peterson, who had treated Robert 30 years earlier. Dr. Henderson had heard the story of the devoted wife, who never left her husband's side, but he had never expected to witness what medical textbooks called impossible. "Mrs. Johnson," he said gently, checking Robert's vital signs while trying to contain his own amazement. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Margaret was still holding Robert's hand, afraid that if she let go, he might slip back into the coma that had held him for 3 decades. "I was playing piano," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. "Our wedding song." About halfway through, his eyes started to flutter, and then he opened them and looked right at me. Robert was still weak and confused, but his eyes followed Margaret's face as she spoke. Every few minutes he would whisper her name, as if he was making sure she was really there. The medical team ran test after test over the next several hours. Brain scans, blood work, reflexes, cognitive assessments, everything they could think of to understand what had happened. The results left everyone stunned. "His brain activity is remarkable," Dr. Henderson told Margaret and the family members who had rushed to the hospital. "After 30 years in a coma, we would expect significant brain damage, but his scans show activity levels that are almost normal for someone his age." David had driven straight from work when Jenny called him. Linda was already booking a flight from California. Michael arrived with his teenage son Tommy, who was now the same age his father had been when Robert first fell into the coma. "Grandpa?" Tommy said tentatively, approaching Robert's bed. "It's me, Tommy. I'm your grandson." Robert's eyes moved to the young man's face, and though he couldn't speak much yet, his expression showed recognition. Margaret had spent 30 years telling Robert about Tommy's milestones, and somehow, impossibly, those conversations had reached him. The story of Robert's awakening began attracting attention beyond the walls of Sunset Manor. A local newspaper, Reporter heard about it from one of the nurses and asked if they could interview Margaret. Then a television station picked up the story. Within a week, news crews from around the country were requesting interviews with the couple who had proven that love could literally wake someone from a coma. Margaret was overwhelmed by all the attention. She had spent 30 years in the quiet, private world of Robert's hospital room, and suddenly everyone wanted to hear their story. "I don't understand why everyone is so surprised," she told one reporter during a brief interview. "I never stopped believing Robert would come back to me. Love doesn't give up even when everyone else does." The medical community was fascinated by Robert's case. Neurologists from prestigious hospitals called to discuss his recovery. Medical journals wanted to publish papers about his awakening. But for Margaret, none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that she could hold a conversation with her husband again. Robert's recovery was gradual but steady. Within 2 weeks, he could speak in complete sentences, though his voice was still weak from 3 decades of disuse. His first clear conversation was with Margaret on a quiet Tuesday morning. "I heard you," he said, squeezing her hand with strength. That surprised both of them. "All these years I heard you talking to me, singing to me, playing music. I was trying so hard to come back to you." Margaret cried every time he spoke those first few weeks. Happy tears, grateful tears, overwhelmed tears. 30 years of stored emotion pouring out all at once. "What was it like?" she asked him one day, as they sat together, both of them marveling at the simple miracle of being able to have a conversation. Robert thought for a long moment before answering. "It was like being in a beautiful dream where you were always there with me. I could hear your voice, feel your hand holding mine, but I couldn't reach you. When you played our song on your birthday, it was like you threw me a rope and pulled me back to the world." Physical therapy became Robert's new daily routine. His muscles had weakened significantly during his long coma, and learning to move again was a slow, sometimes frustrating process. But Margaret was there for every session, cheering him on when he managed to sit up on his own, celebrating when he took his first shaky steps with a walker. "We're going to dance again," Robert told her one day during a particularly difficult therapy session. "Maybe not like we used to, but we're going to dance." The piano that Jenny had brought for Margaret's birthday became a permanent fixture in their room. Margaret played every day now, sometimes their old favorites, sometimes hymns they had sung together in church, sometimes just simple melodies that made Robert smile. The media attention continued to grow. Their story was featured on national television programs and in magazines around the world. People wrote letters from every continent, sharing their own stories of love and hope, thanking Margaret and Robert for proving that miracles still happen. But Margaret found the most meaningful responses came from other families dealing with coma patients. Wives, husbands, children, and parents who had been told to give up hope wrote to say that Robert's awakening had inspired them to keep believing. "Your story gave me strength to keep talking to my daughter," wrote one mother whose child had been in a coma for 6 months after a car accident. "2 weeks after reading about you, she opened her eyes. 6 months after his awakening, Robert was strong enough to leave Sunset Manor." Margaret had mixed feelings about leaving the place that had been their home for 30 years. But she was excited about the possibility of returning to their house on Maple Street. The homecoming was emotional for the entire family. David and Michael had maintained the house over the years, keeping Margaret's piano tuned and the garden that Robert loved in perfect condition. When Robert saw his tomato plants, now tended by his grandsons, he cried for the first time since waking up. "It's just like I remember," he said, sitting in his wheelchair on the front porch where he and Margaret used to spend summer evenings. Their first Sunday morning back home was perhaps the most meaningful moment of Robert's recovery. Margaret sat at their piano, the same one where she had played "The Way You Look Tonight" thousands of times over the years. Robert, still weak but determined, sat beside her on the bench. Together, they played and sang their wedding song, just like they had every Sunday morning for 40 years before the stroke. Robert's voice was different now, softer and more fragile, but it still harmonized perfectly with Margaret's piano playing. 70 years of marriage, Robert said when the song ended. 30 of them in ways we never expected, but every single year filled with love. Margaret looked at her husband, This man who had defied every medical prediction, who had come back to her through the power of music and unwavering love, and smiled the same smile she had given him in that church basement, 72 years earlier. "And we're still making beautiful music together," she said, taking his hand in hers. Their story continued to inspire people around the world, proving that some things, love, faith, and the power of music, are stronger than anything medical, science can explain. Margaret and Robert spent their remaining time teaching others that giving up is never the answer, and that sometimes the greatest miracles happen to those who love deeply enough to wait for them.